larger words, the more prominent words that we've seen. Can we just remove the, so right in the middle of that word tab, we've got top down. Followed in quite a large number of responses for under-resourced, insufficient, limited. On a slightly more positive note, we've got developing. Highly needed, demand-driven. There is a one-size-for-all training, donor compliance focus, standards times context, compliance-driven, one-directional, lackluster, low priority, disjointed, traditional, unaligned, challenged, challenging. I wonder if any of the panel members would like to share. Are you surprised by the results? Is this what you would have anticipated as being the words used to describe capacity development in its current form? I'll start maybe in the room. Steve or Genevieve?
I mean, I think that shows the variety of different attitudes that people have. I mean, there is no uniformed collective view on capacity building, which does produce a slightly confused state of mind within the sector.
Thank you, Steve.
And I would agree to that and say that it would be interesting on each of these words to speak with the person who wrote them and a perspective on what led them to write these words. But I can probably echo that there is a trend in prioritizing and founding less capacity development, and but I'm surprised at the uniform view of seeing capacity development. I find there is more and more diversity in how capacity development is.
It's nice to hear some promising aspects. We will cover in a bit more detail as we go through this conversation. Would any of the panel members online care to share any reflections at this point?
I think this words show us that capacity development is really important, but still it's not clear for everyone how to get it and how to build it in quality.
Thank you, Daria. A lack of clarity perhaps there. Anyone else? We'll move on and start looking at some of our pre-prepared questions before we take some audience questions. If you look now at your Menti, you'll see that it's still open, but is now open to receiving your individual questions. So it will be the same link and the same password. You can share your questions throughout the session, and I'll periodically take opportunity to put them into the conversation. Your questions, as I said, will be anonymous unless you attribute some identifying factors to them. Okay, let's begin with some pre-prepared questions then. I'm going to call on Simeone and Steve and Ala in the first instance to describe what they see as the biggest challenges facing capacity development, either in the sector as a whole or within your own environment. Simeone, maybe we could start with you. And Alex, you can take up the next.
Thank you. Thank you, Angharad, and first of all, acknowledging the opportunity to share the stories and experiences from the Pacific, Bulubinaka, and speaking from Suva in Fiji. For me, one of the biggest challenges that we face in terms of capacity building is looking at the cost that are associated with capacity building. For the Pacific, one is the availability of capacity building programs targeting strengthening the humanitarian sector, and also in terms of strengthening knowledge and technical expertise for local counterparts. In most instances, we access these different programs overseas, and hardly these capacity building programs are available locally, however, in bits and pieces. Again, in order for us to access this, the amount of money that you need to pay to just travel from Fiji, say for example, to Australia, it's an exorbitant amount, as you have to pay for airfares, and then you have to pay for the training fees, and then there are other costs that are associated with it in terms of while there, your living costs in whichever country that you're looking at to access these capacity building programs. And then also in the region, income level are not that high, and also and with the low income level, most Pacific Islanders and most organizations in the Pacific, they depend on donor funding and external support for them to be able to access these different capacity building programs. And with that, also taking into considerations the geographical locations in the Pacific. So just to provide a bit of context of the Pacific, we are a region with vast oceans and with small island states spread across these vast oceans, the Pacific Ocean. And with that, in order for us to provide a program, a capacity building program, or say, for example, host a training, it requires a lot of resources in terms of funding, and also it requires a lot of resources in terms of getting expert trainers to come in to provide these trainings. And that also, again, it affects the cost. And then also with the high demand of local experts, high demand of people locally and also overseas, one of the biggest challenges also is the sustainability of knowledge, and second is the continuity of capacity building programs. And due to the high cost involved, continuity of capacity building programs, it tends to be inconsistent, and then that is due to the competing priorities for available funding. And then also the brain drain in terms of the turnover of people at the organizational level, also at the country level, and at the regional level, in which we've built their capacity to a certain level, and then making them marketable in the labor market, and then they accessing other opportunities overseas and outside of the region. And that, again, leads back to for us to retain people, to re-implement programs. And sometimes you need to do repetitive programs in order to train new people to come in and fit at the same level at which those that had left, the vacuum that those had left behind in terms of the capacity vacuum. And that, again, is the biggest challenge. Is something that we have to consider when we're doing capacity building. That capacity building, one, you need to ensure sustainability of knowledge. So looking at how do you transition knowledge within an organization, within the, at the national level and also at the regional level, but also at the same time understanding and recognizing that capacity building programs, sometimes it'll be repetitive, and sometimes you need to retrain people in order to maintain that knowledge and also in order to maintain the expertise that you have within the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. So it's interesting to hear the impact of that relative isolation that the Pacific Islands are experiencing in relation to capacity development. I wonder if I could maybe call on Steve next to input your own perspectives around challenges.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I think I'm the only panelist here that's not directly involved in the operational process of capacity building, which may make me completely unqualified to speak here. It does mean that I come at this question from a slightly broader systems perspective, particularly focused on capacity building or capacity development's impact on localization, which is a kind of theme which is very close to my heart. And I think there are, a whole multitude of different challenges, but I think it would be wrong of us not to acknowledge that there has been a huge amount of capacity developed over the last couple of decades in the sector. And, every month there is a crisis or a disaster in places like Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, and in the Pacific Islands that we don't hear about because there's capacity there to deal with it. It doesn't become an international incident. So there are good examples of where capacity has been developed, encouraged, and people are able to better respond to emergencies. But I think we can all agree there hasn't been the same impetus of shifting power towards local and national actors that we had hoped after the Grand Bargain in 2016. And I think, there are many, many different challenges that we can locate. For me, I think there's a major challenge around language. I think that, particularly in the localization space, we've talked quite a lot about the difference between capacity development, capacity building, capacity strengthening, and the importance of recognizing that there is already existing capacity in many organizations and in many communities. And I think that's correct. But I think it does still leave us with this nebulous term of capacity. What is capacity? You can have organizational capacity, you can have individual capacity, you can have capacity to respond in, first phase of an emergency, capacity to do disaster development. Capacity needs to be relative. It needs to have an objective in mind. I've got friends who are excellent tap dancers. That's a capacity, that's a skill, that's not going to help them in a humanitarian emergency. So I think really focusing and being clearer about what our objectives are when we're talking about capacity is key. I think one of the difficulties when we don't have these clear definitions and objectives is it doesn't allow for any accountability. And that often suits people who are, let's say, higher up in the response chain, because they're not forced to show any evidence they've actually built capacity over time. So if we're clearer about what the objectives are, we can hold people accountable when those objectives aren't met, or we can learn from it as well and find better ways of doing it. I think the second major issue, as Simeone has mentioned, is the lack of specific capacity development funding. Most of the sector, with some really, impressive exceptions, still sees capacity development as a sub-product of project implementation. That means that the lead organization in any kind of consortium or grant management chain, which is normally an international organization, is the organization that implements the capacity building. And it's also the organization that decides what capacity needs to be developed or needs to be built. And they naturally identify the things which are most interest to them. That's not because they're not good people, that's just because they work for institutions. And when institutions grow beyond a certain number of people, they start to take on their institutional dynamics. So they're going to act in their own interest. And that's what we've seen very much. So if we really want to shift power, we need to separate out, or I use the expression conscious decoupling, but we need to separate out capacity development from project implementation. And we've got to recognize the capacity of specialist organizations to do capacity building. It's ridiculous, sorry to use strong language, but I think it's ridiculous to believe that the same organization that does direct implementation and manages programs is going to be exactly the same organization that is best at doing capacity development or any of the other kind of cross-cutting themes that we have in our sector. Let's bring back the specialists, let's invest in those specialists that only do capacity building in certain situations, or only do gender, or only do PSEA. There is a role for specialist organizations, and we've got to get donors to invest in those organizations that are able to share that capacity and those skills.
Thank you, Steve. Already starting to see now where we're moving it from challenges into possibilities, which is an exciting phase. We'll explore that a little bit further in the conversation. I just want to turn to Ala first of all to share his perspective on the current challenges to capacity development. Ala, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I just had a technical issue. Nice to meet you, everyone. This is Ala from Syria. I'm based in Turkey. I'm talking from Istanbul. For this area, actually, if we want to speak about the biggest challenges, and also, as my colleague Stephen mentioned, we should see the relation between shifting power and capacity building. But as well as if we want to ask the local and national actors about that, as we had a mapping stage about localization and capacity building with Save the Children Sweden in Africa, and also in the Syria and Middle and other country in Middle East, the local all of the local and national actors, a lot of them mentioned about some major challenges, especially for the limited time, limited funding, and the fact that this organization seldom had the access to other funding than project funding. But for sure, it comes with other challenges, but we need to ask ourselves some question before to select this challenging, and when we want to speak about capacity building. The first question, to what extent do we as international actors, organizations, INGO and donors truly support local leadership and ownership of capacity development process? Here, I speak about leadership and ownership for local organization to lead this capacity development. They facing a lot of challenges in this area. Why they don't lead or own the process for capacity building? The second question: are we providing capacity development opportunity that are sustainable? Are we providing capacity development opportunity with the quality? Also, here I mean for the INGO and donor, as well as are we supporting local and national organization to grow, or just to see how they dealing with our requirement for due diligence? Are we supporting local and national organization to keep their organization identity? Because we just see that a lot of practice or think in capacity building just to copy paste the INGO without anything in the organizational identity. And here we should focus a lot about institutional capacity strengthening. A fundamental question here is how we as international actors, INGO or donor, understand capacity. We tend to speak about capacity in a simplistic way, and as if we all have the same understanding. However, capacity is complex, and also we should have some question. We should know them before we start. What capacity are we talking about it? It's clear, my voice? Sorry.
Yes, and in fact,
Yes.
your point resonates
Yes.
a lot with the conversations I had before this session. The creation of the questions was collaborative, and actually that point about only being really qualified to implement specific grants, for example, was one that came
Yes.
through a lot with many of the local organizations that we were consulting with. It's obviously a well-recognized challenge in.
Doesn't even if people stand at the back, there's still
There
chairs
are.
here.
Thanks, Steve. Just about to say, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 chairs at the front. If anyone would like to have a little seat, it's a long time to stand. Thank you for finding the room, everybody. It's nice to see such a full house. Let's focus in a little bit. We've already touched upon this idea of local ownership. And I want to focus a little bit on the challenges surrounding that by calling on Sajid and Daria, because we've already heard a little bit about how the decisions for capacity needs, priorities surrounding capacity, how we're defining capacity, is historically been based on an international rather than a local agenda. Reflected in the language that we're using within our learning, it's reflected in our delivery methodologies, the topics and the skills that are being taught, and even the trainers and the way that training providers or implementing organizations are being commissioned to develop capacity. So I call on Sajid and Daria to share their understanding of the consequences of this trend. And just before I ask you, could I just ask that you remove that shared screen so that we can see the speaker instead? That would be really excellent. Thank you. So perhaps we could start with Sajid, is that okay?
Yeah, thanks, Evans. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
When we talk about international humanitarian system, I think from the perspective where I'm based, South Asia, majority of humanitarian action is led by development actors, the government, and the development agencies. So the first sort of disconnect here is the language of international humanitarian system and the development actors, the difference. Their core values are different. The core values of humanitarian system, the humanitarian charter, and the core values of development sector are completely different. But we haven't, over the years, spoken enough or built leadership amongst the development actors for humanitarian action. So leadership for humanitarian action amongst the development actors is probably the one of the biggest sort of missing pieces. And as UN system where I work, about I think 5 years ago, we gave a call for linking humanitarian and development, and we are committed to that. And I think that's our big sort of a challenge, that the core values of both these groups are very different. So enabling them, and Steve spoke about, is it organizational preparedness or is it the sector preparedness? I think we need both. There's a lot of capacity building need across the development actors in South Asia. And there's also commitment to, I might speak about that a little later. As far as the technical excellence on humanitarian action goes, there's still a far cry. A lot of technical excellence has to come in vis-a-vis the way we used to work about 10-15 years ago. I think a lot of technical excellence has been eroded over the years, particularly in sectors such as water and sanitation, shelter, settlement planning. I think these are the areas where there's been erosion, but there are areas where we have improved. For example, the cash-based programming. We have improved by leaps and bounds on cash-based programming. There are newer approaches to delivering life-saving action, and I think one of the areas where I think there is a need for capacity building amongst the development, there is a private sector as well. There's a businesses. So the whole market-based approach to humanitarian action, I don't think we have spent any effort on building capacity on that front. There's a lot. So for me, the whole universe of capacity building looks like an intertwined sort of rope in which, or maybe a DNA, where one strand is humanitarian, the second strand is the government, and the third strand is the private sector. And and they will fall apart if there are no horizontal linkages. And I think identifying those linkages between the three and building and strengthening them and building capacity over those linkages. I think that's the sort of framework within which we should be operating. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sajid. Identifying some of the gaps that are a consequence of that trend in international agendas. I wonder if I could call on Daria to share your perspective.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to share our experience from Ukrainian point of view. Actually, I agree with all of my colleagues who shared the challenges. Yes, language is a big challenge, and when we invited to different conferences or seminars, we are facing that all of them are in English. And if we will face the Ukrainian reality, we will see that it's a big challenge that in Ukraine is really a small percent of people speaking English. And yeah, it was also a challenge with traveling, as same as on Fiji, yes, that we were invited to travel to Poland to visit some sessions for some education about humanitarian reaction. And for now, to travel from Ukraine to Poland, you need 17 hours by train. So probably people who is working with humanitarian reaction right now, they don't have 17 hours to go from Kiev to Poland and then back. So it's a lot of time, same. And for another challenge to travel abroad is that in Ukraine, it's not allowed for minors goes abroad. So they need additional requirements now, additional allowance from government to travel abroad. And so many actors like NGO heads, they can't travel and even for this education. And I also agree with our point of view that capacity building shouldn't be focused on creating some small prototypes of NGOs on local level. It should be focused on building a strong local NGO with their identity, local NGOs, yes. They should be focused on building their capacities to start humanitarian reaction after humanitarian reaction or rebuilding or recovery after the finishing of humanitarian action, because for sure we need a humanitarian response right now immediately, and everything is understandable that they need these skills about humanitarian standards and working with people in disaster, and everything was included in standard capacity, humanitarian capacity building program. But if we talk about future, about strategy, we need to think if this disaster comes again or another disaster comes again on this territory, what these local actors can do after. And it's really important to ask them what knowledge you miss to work without our support. Yes, without our support as an NGO. Do you need the skills of fundraising? Do you need the skills of project management, financial management? And these skills are really missing because we organized several discussions on Ukrainian level, like several roundtables, and all of our participants, they say, okay, yes, we understand a little bit about fundraising. We understand how to work with project. We worked for a lot of years, like 10, 12, 20 years on our local level. But for sure, we want to understand how to work on with international financing, with international donors, because now for when humanitarian response will finish after victory of Ukraine, we will need to rebuild our country. And we need skills how to be a strong local actor to rebuild our communities. And this is something that's missing. Capacity building should be focused on a strategy to build strong local actors, not prototypes of humanitarian NGOs.
Thank you for sharing that, Daria. It's always really interesting to have a tangible example as well. It's those stories that I think resonate the most with us. So thank you for sharing a couple of instances of genuinely how you've been impacted in terms of capacity development within the current context. I think this idea of holding up a mirror to the international community or trying to create mini international communities on that local level is something that potentially this next question will help us explore a little. We've got one more question to the panel before I would like to open it up to the audience. And for those of you who've joined us most recently, we've got a platform on menti.com where you can submit questions online. So go to menti.com and input the code. It's in the chat and it's in the back of the room here, 41563028. Feel free to include your name if you would like us to recognize who the questions come from. So before we come to an audience question or two, I think I just want to touch on this idea of local ownership and what we need to do to better support that shift in power. The advent of the grand bargaining and perhaps even more recently with COVID-19, there was perhaps hope born that local ownership was on the increase with the reduction in international staff presence. We relied more on local capacity. However, there appears to be little evidence now of a really transformational shift in those power dynamics. So I'm going to ask Genevieve and Steve and Signone if you'd like to tell us what you think needs to be done differently to better support that shift in power. Genevieve, would you like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So I can speak from the perspective of CHS Alliance and the training we have been providing quality and accountability on PACH investigation. So maybe more specifically on the core humanitarian standard, which is the standard that we've tried to develop in a way that is as participative as possible. We recognize it depends a lot on the context for the implementation. And we've always, and more, we try to play that role of facilitator where we provide training resources, training material to our members, to a broader community of humanitarian stakeholders, and really encourage them to own this material and contextualize it and apply it in a way they think is best for their context and their need. We've got fairly good feedback, very encouraging feedback times and again of how people we've trained have reused this material and organized training in their own context. Now it relies a lot on, of course, availability of resources they have and having organizations that have the capacity of supporting these trainings. And so we find that it's a little random and we really love to find ways of encouraging them or encouraging our participants to deliver this training as much as possible. And it brings me to the second point with this question that I think there's a lot of, and every panelist has underlined how much great local capacities there is. And the question is how to visibilize these and how to give them more prominent seats and really realize the tremendous work that is being done by international but also national organizations within humanitarian response and after. And that's probably a role that training provider and also network organization like CHS Alliance can do more, talking to their network, talking to their constituents. And maybe a last point on that also that I find really interesting is this call for expert trainer, as the name was mentioned, that I found that there too much are European-based people, and we struggle a lot as a training deliverer to, I mean, we know where there are good local or national trainer and experts on topics, but they're often, it's difficult to have these available for training times and again when we need them, and we cannot promise them employment time and again that they can sustain a role as trainers. So of course then they need to make a living, and so it's a little bit of a struggle, and there are ways here probably like partner more with their employers so we can free them to deliver resource to deliver training if they're interested. But this is all areas I know that several trainings providers are trying to explore, and that we don't yet have like the crystal clear answer. Steve, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, let's just take a step back and go back to kind of thinking about why wasn't there this shift during COVID-19. I mean, there was all this excitement. It was at the same time as Black Lives Matter was in its ascendancy. I mean, obviously, COVID-19 pandemic was a huge tragedy, but for those interested in humanitarian reform, it was a very exciting kind of moment because it looked like things would change. But I think we had a lot of assumptions which were erroneous. Firstly, I think we completely underestimated how much of final mile delivery was already being done by local and national actors. I also think we overestimated the amount of final delivery that was done by international actors. Most international actors don't spend much time on the front line, even if they're in the countries where projects are being implemented, due to access, insecurity, and the amount of bureaucracy there is in running programs. Most international staff get trapped behind the desk at, in capital cities. So the fact that they might as well be in London as in Nairobi. There wasn't a huge shift, there wasn't a huge change. But also, if we put aside ethics and principles for a second and take just a kind of political economy and analysis, the reason why there wasn't change was that the Coalition for Change didn't get behind any kind of coherent platform in a way that could change the incentives of the international organizations, particularly the donors. If we want change to happen, we've got to start thinking about those power balances and about how the actors asking for change can better coordinate their messages and ask for very, very specific changes that people can coalesce around. Now, I'm not going to say what I think, well, I am going to say what I think those changes are, but that's certainly not up to me. I think in terms of how we do shift this power dynamic, I know that many of you in the room might see me as a long-haired hippie, but actually I'm a big fan of a free market, and I think that donors particularly need to try to support free market dynamics as much as possible. I think one of the ways of doing that is, and an issue that particularly close to my heart, is we need to increase indirect costs going to local and national actors. Once local and national actors have greater or fairer access to indirect costs, they will decide how to spend those resources, and they will spend those resources in a way that best suits their objectives. Furthermore, that will potentially create a market for local agencies and individuals that do capacity building, which comes back to some of the other points that have been raised. Why does it need to be Europeans and North Americans that are doing this capacity building? Well, that's where the market is. So we've got to try to stimulate a market in other parts of the globe. And that, I think, indirect cost is one way of being able to do that. I think, secondly, and this idea of decoupling capacity development from project implementation is absolutely key. When we are giving money for particular activity, particular projects, we should be giving completely separate pots of money for global enablers. Now, I'm not just talking about capacity development, I'm talking about all those cross-cutting things, all those H2H-like organizations that bring specific specialisms to the table and can provide that right across the response, rather than just providing it to individual agencies. That can be done in a number of different ways. But I think we if we're going to start thinking about the future of capacity development, we could completely invert the system and start moving towards a system whereby donors gave local and national actors conditional cash vouchers to be able to purchase their own capacity building. That would mean that the agencies that do capacity development would actually have to change and make themselves more attractive to local and national actors, and we have to start being more service orientated rather than donor orientated. Okay, so we're working essentially within the same model. We just shifted who makes the decisions and who chooses who does capacity building and what that capacity building's objectives are. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. Can you imagine a world where INGOs bid to local actors? What an exciting change that could be. I'd just like to call on Simeone. Would you like to share your insights on this one as well?
Yeah, for me, when we're talking about power dynamics and transformational shift, one of the questions I would ask, who has the resources to drive this shift? And then also at the same time is we need to ensure that we build on local ownership. And building local ownership, that is looking at participation of local stakeholders across all parts of the capacity building process, looking at the designing of it, looking at developing of the products, and then across all levels. And while doing that, we also need to consider that there's a need to empower local counterparts, local stakeholders, for them to be able to sustain the knowledge, sustain also ensuring the continuity of programs that we come in and then implement, and also own the different actions that are implemented. The other point around local ownership is ensuring that when you are with providing resources or funding, you also need to be ensuring that there is an enabling environment that enables local stakeholders to be able to be part of the decision-making processes in terms of what needs to be done, how things are done, and where do we need to do things or implement actions. And that's also looking at access to information and also ensuring that there is a level playing field and also mutual partnership and understanding in terms of implementing programs and also in terms of coming in and also having that knowledge sharing. And then when we look at the accountability component of it, for me, there's a big belief in while we need to have institutional systems to ensure accountability, it also needs to be complemented with an element of trust. Trusting your local counterparts, trusting your local stakeholders who are implementing the different programs. And then also looking at contextualizing content. In order to have ownership, your content implementation needs to be contextualized to the local context. And I think one of the jargon that's been thrown around in the localization space is whereby you act local and you think global. So you think in global standards, you think in global frameworks, but you are acting locally and considering the local context and also the environment at the local level. Another point around ensuring this transformational shift in the power dynamic is localizing capacity building programs and systems. This is considering one, recognizing local knowledge and local expertise that are already there, and also understanding the level of engagement that you're engaging in. How you engage at the community level will be different when you're engaging at the national level and also at the regional level. And with that, also by bringing the capacity building programs to the places where you are engaging at and at the level where you're engaging at. One example that I would say is RedR Australia, building up to the COVID-19 and also during COVID-19, they diversify the humanitarian roster to also include Pacific Islanders to be part of the roster. And with that, it supported the support that are provided to Pacific Island countries in which Pacific Islanders complements the technical support and technical expertise that are provided by other roster members within that are in responding to COVID-19 and the multiple other disaster events that occurred during that period. And also looking at that, taking that capacity building program to the community, to the country, And since the beginning of that program so far, there's 112 Pacific Islanders that have been trained through the program on the essential of humanitarian practice, and also trained around how do you work within a hostile environment situation. And for me, the last point I would emphasize on is around localizing knowledge and technical expertise. This will ensure the sustainability of knowledge and also the sustainability of technical expertise. And with these different trainings that has occurred, so far there's been 30 Pacific Islanders that's been part of the RedR Australia roster. And then also with that, 11 Pacific Islanders are currently in the field, actually doing that, sharing their knowledge with host organizations in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi, and to all our panel members for those really clear pathways forward, perhaps, capacity development, which we'll return to towards the end of the conversation. I'm going to draw on Alex now to share if there are any questions on the Menti that you would like to put forward to our panel, and if not, perhaps you'll go to the room. Alex, over to you.
Yes, thank you. We do have a question here for the panel. Question is, would a pooled fund for capacity building under a country-based advisory board help make it more relevant, appropriate and inclusive to local needs? In emergencies, link it to the country response plans. Yeah, so that question's there and should be on the screen as well for you as well.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, if we can keep it on the screen, I think that would be really helpful. Is there any panelists that immediately want to jump onto that one? I think I might suggest that Daria has got something to say in the first instance.
Yes, if I can. Actually, I agree that it can help a lot to create some national program because this program with all of the standards points of humanitarian capacity building program could be adopted to local level and to local law. So probably this education can be more on local reality based, and but it's really important to think who will create this education and who will be leading all of this program. And I think it's something that we go as a challenge. For example, in Ukraine, there are several organizations that provide a strong capacity building for years in Ukraine, but before a full-scale invasion in 2022, we didn't work a lot with humanitarian response. So probably there is not so many practitioners in humanitarian capacity building in Ukraine, but there are other trainers that can provide different capacity building activities for NGO, and they can be trained as trainers for humanitarian capacity building.
Thank you, Daria. Keep coming back to this idea of control, which is such an interesting one. Steve, maybe a comment from you, and then we'll have one more question as well.
No, just to say that I think pooled funding for capacity strengthening is a great idea at the country level. There are some good examples of this already. There's the HART facility in Myanmar that it was a kind of pooled funding mechanism, but had a specific window for capacity development that organizations could apply for. I think an even better example is Start Fund Bangladesh, that started off as a pool funding mechanism with lots of kind of international organizations working at the Bangladesh level, so Save the Children Bangladesh, ACF Bangladesh. But it's since, over a period of about 3 years, it's diversified, and now the majority of its members are local and national organizations, and they have a specific budget for capacity building with specific objectives. What is key is who is on that advisory board, and making sure that you have local and national voices there that have a genuine interest in building capacity across the board and not just for the.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. Plenty of examples are always helpful, and the Myanmar example is actually one that I had some experience of in the past as well. It is an interesting model. Perhaps, Alex, have we got time for one more question?
Yes, we do. I will put on the screen there. So the next question is, if we speak about shifting the power with the bulk of all funding channeled through UN organisations, should the focus be on making them more accountable first?
Panel members, is there anybody who would like to?
Please.
Let's go to online first of all. Ala, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. Actually, for this question, it's very important because, to be honest, a lot of local organization or national organization struggling with the fund from UN agency and in relation with the shifting power, for sure, should be more accountable first, should be process to measure the change if we can make a change based on this process or not, but also to be honest, a lot of local and national organization facing a lot of challenges from UN mechanisms in shifting power. So I think we should have relation between this project between from both sides, from local and also UN agency, because what they say or what they express about UN strategy in any response and also shifting power, they think, and you know that, as you know, everyone, UN by interagency lead everything and just like give a small space for local organization and for some partner who are recommended from the INGO. So we should open more space for other local NGO who actually not participate in the cluster and interagency mechanisms, support them for that and encourage them more about this process. So in this question, we need that from both sides, from local and from UN agency, because again, all the, not all for sure, but we have a lot of donors and INGOs, also UN agency, they push their agenda more than the local organization. And to be honest, based on my experience with the local organization, I worked with like for 8 years for local organization, the UN agency push more about their strategy more than the local and national strategy to support them and more sustainability. So accountable first, but from both sides. Thank you.
Thanks for that interpretation, Ala. Steve, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, just to say that, I mean, thank you for the question, but I find this type of question similar to the argument that there's no point in doing anything about the environment until India and China change their policies. The way that policies change is when there is the threat of a good example. And I think that it will be CSOs that change first, and then that will cause pressure for the UN systems to change. So I think if we wait for the UN systems to change first, we're going to be waiting an awful long time.
Thank you. I'm going to return to our pre-prepared questions now and pick up on a thread that Genevieve actually started us off on a little earlier on. So we recognize quite readily, I think, that individuals and organizations struggle to provide sufficient evidence of their existing capabilities for lots of different reasons. But this is despite several efforts in the past to create, for example, uniform benchmarks in order to measure. Current efforts that are quite prominent include at the individual level an increase in certified training programs, a surge in badging. At the organizational level, we've now got capacity assessment tools, we've got verification schemes to measure against global standards of practice. How optimistic should we feel about these approaches and what else is needed? And I'm just going to ask Genevieve if you'd like to start us off on that one, since you picked up the thread earlier, and then I'm going to turn to Ala. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for recognizing these different trends. I think all these trends, whether they are at institutional or individual level, they need both to be accessible and to be recognized. And of course, then the answer to accessibility and recognition depends on whether you're talking about individual or institutional level. I just want to build here on the institutional approach of verification and verification certification scheme. They do provide a great learning incentive for the organization, and certainly a great incentive to invest into capacity development of staff, but also like longer term and more sustainable institutional capacity system. So they have that great plus. That said, the organization will need, and especially for them to be also accessible for a broad number of organizations. A lot of organizations accompaniment and funding and mentoring. Also, it's not just about assessing yourself, but also what you will do afterwards. Once you have assessed, when you have identified these gaps, and so how will you be able to bridge the gap, so to say. And similarly at the individual level, well, I think it's a little bit different. I mean, there are of course the opportunity for certification scheme at the individual level, but they might be costly, lengthy. It's great for those who can go through these schemes, but again, if you're talking about project-based capacity building fund, they might be actually longer than the duration of a project. So that might be also blocked for, or that might prevent people to attend them. And then of course, they're only available in a limited number of languages. Yet again, an obstacle. So there are pros and cons, but there's definitely a need to make them more accessible. And for badging, maybe also worth mentioning, I think it's there are great initiatives in there, but again, to which extent are they recognized by people who hire workers, and what's the level of accessibility to them if you're not working for an organization who already has this badging system in place. So there might be opportunities there, but there's definitely more noise that need to be made around this.
Thank you. Ala?
Yes, thank you, Angharad. Actually, also I totally agree with. But also, let me say, sometimes I feel well with in some place, but not good in another place, especially for the individual, because I think there is no clear tracking and no clear goal for the individual learning. So I highly recommend it to have a pathway for any individual to know and to measure his or her change for the learning. And for sure, the organization must take this into their account and work to correct it. Like, I mean, to contact between the individual objective and the organizational objective for the learning pathway. For the learning pathway. So also, I mean, here there are training programs for individual. It's not related for their duties or for their responsibility, because as you know, in a lot of contexts across the world, we have, for example, two types of work from headquarters and in the field, and there is no access and between the headquarters and the field. Like in Syria, in the north of Syria, the headquarters based on Turkey, but they operating their project in Syria. We have the same in Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, Palestine. So they should have like take in our account the difference between the context based on the learning for in the individual. For the organization, I also again, we should differentiate between due diligence and institutional capacity strengthening. And I think we should focus as INGOs or donors more about institutional capacity strengthening for more sustainability. Because if we want to ask any local or national organization, what is your aim from your organization? We want it to be more sustainable. So institutional capacity strengthening is very important because which aim to risk issues, program quality, and also for the organization capacity development, for more strengthening for them, for more sustainability. We should not consider OCA like just organizational capacity assessment, then action plan. We should dealing with the institutional capacity strengthening like a program cycle or project cycle. It's a long-term process, not just assessment, and we will provide training based on this gap, based on their gap. No, we should take a long time for preparation, for assessment, for planning for these gaps, for implementation their development. So we should consider that like a program cycle, not just from one stage, and for more long time, and full fund for institutional capacity strengthening for to the local organization. Because as I mentioned, they wanted for more sustainability, more effective training, but also they should be connecting between their organizational objective and also individual objective, and have a pathway to see what pathway, and also like meal process to measure our their change in everything. So institutional capacity strengthening should take like a program cycle for a long-term time, and also long-term funding for their development journey. Thank you.
Very much for your comments as well, Genevieve. I think we're almost leading on from that a little bit to looking at the limitation in learning opportunities. So we're seeing that for many local actors, I think that lots of you touched on this as well, Daria, especially from your experience, is that the availability, the training that is available, the learning opportunities that are available aren't always relevant. They're not always transferable. There's a lack of sustainability and long-term view in the way in which the capacity needs are measured and addressed. Are they of sufficient quality to effectively enhance capacities? Is there incentive for organizations to support the individual learning pathway? Daria, I'm going to ask you, what have you seen, or what do you hope to see differently in the future in the way that training providers are commissioned and operate to achieve learning that's more accessible, more equitable and effective? Perhaps talking mostly at that individual level, but at the organizational level too, if that's something that you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, firstly, I hope that before create any program, you will start asking beneficiaries what do you want to learn, and it's something that's really important. Ask people what they need or what they want to do. So actually, if you want to create any program, go to that local level and ask people, what do you know already? What do you want to learn more? Because like in Ukraine, we are not really weak NGO sector. We were growing our civil society since 2014. So for 8 years, it was really a lot of great programs that support NGO sector, but not in humanitarian response. It's something that we're really missing. We will learn a lot about project management, financial management, and everything, but not in a humanitarian response. And when disasters happen, that we understood that we're missing this knowledge. So firstly, ask people what you still need, because same time when we organize education for our network, we ask them, did you pass any trainings already from different other INGO? For example, we started one piece that is really missing now in Ukraine. We miss trainings for personal safety of volunteers. So trainings about first aid, about mining safety, and it's something that's really missing. And when we start researching among our network who pass, who don't pass such trainings already, we understood that only one organization had such trainings, and couple organizations organized such trainings for the volunteers with support of some donors. To think about program, ask people what they already did, because probably they will not come a second time on same training because they don't have time for that. They thinking how to invest their time in proper way. What else is think about strategically on capacity building, as Ala said, think not about cover one training and calculate how many people come and how many people receive certificate. Let's rethink the system of evaluating everything in numbers. Let's think in strategic way when we see the results of our education. If we give any education, let's see in several months, in couple years, how the work of this organization changed. And it would be something that we can count as a result, as a good capacity building, yes. If we change thinking of our local NGO on strategic way, it's something that can show the quality of our capacity building program. So I really ask NGO donors who want to create any program, start talking with local actors before creating something. We can save a lot of resources for that.
Thank you, Dalia, advocating for opening up that dialogue. I know that Steve, you've already talked a little bit about what changes you might like to see to the face of training providers, commissions and operate, and Ala, you've done the same. But would either of you two just like to add any brief comments on that at this stage?
Ala, please go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. As you know, for capacity building, there is no one fits for all approaches. Actually, local and national NGOs heavily influenced by the social, political, and economic environment in which they operate their project and their program, and are subject to constant internal change, and also they're influenced by external change. Therefore, capacity development is often a complex, multi-layer process involving multi-play actors and influences. To be honest, what I would like to say, take more actions, because we read a lot of report, a lot of learning case study, a lot of mapping about capacity building. We have a lot of points for learning, but I think we should take in our account this learning. We just report everything with a few points to take in action. We more action about that. And as Daria said, we should designing a learning plan based on a triangulation between INGO or donors, local NGO and the other stakeholders, and have a link between all of those to have a good and clear learning plan. The next point, we should encourage and support local NGO to lead the process and providing funding to access support from their preferred capacity development providers. Also, we should develop and use better monitoring and evaluation approaches aimed for local capacity development. Again, we should like measure that change based the individuals and based on the organization, based the individuals, especially for the skills, behavior, attitude. Also, we should, I think, develop better tools for assessing existing capacity, not just focusing on the existing gaps, because we should, in this point, encourage a lot about capacity sharing, not just among the local NGO. Here, in my working with Save the Children Sweden, I ask the local NGO what in Somalia, what your inputs or recommendation for us for institutional capacity strengthening. He said, Ala, you mentioned a lot about capacity sharing, but we should have capacity sharing among INGOs and donors as well, not just for you encourage us to have capacity sharing between just the local. So we should have tool for assessing existing capacity as opposite to existing caps, and encourage more capacity sharing. Also support locally lead research on capacity development. And last point from my side, more coordinate about capacity development effort among all the stakeholders who are providing capacity development opportunity to the same local organizations. And this point is very important for more collaboration and more coordination between all the stakeholders are providing the capacity development. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Anna. And very briefly, Steve, do you want to add a single comment on that one?
Just to say that, I mean, having seen the success of the localization agenda, I'm naturally slightly skeptic about capacity development, but there are some really good developments, and I think it's worth noting. I mean, the CHS, I think, is an excellent framework. I would like to see it evaluating responses as opposed to just organizations, but maybe that's something they'll consider doing in the future, because as Ala's saying, you know, we mapping out existing capabilities and seeing how that changes, particularly when there's a huge international response, I think would be very interesting. I think we just need to get back to a basic idea that the humanitarian sector needs humanitarian enablers. And I would like to see us in a situation where 10% of all humanitarian funds went to humanitarian enablers. And again, not just capacity development, a whole array of different enablers. We now have the H2H network that is a perfect platform to start to invest in. We just need to get more donors on board with that, and therefore we need more CSOs and international INGOs advocating for donors to support people like the H2H network.
Thank you. Succinct point. An interesting note to end that question on. Alex, let's just have a question from the audience before we conclude this session. Do you have one ready prepared for us?
Yes, I do. So the question is, there is a risk of equating capacity building / capacity strengthening to trainings. We need to think beyond training local actors. I would appreciate examples beyond trainings, and I will put that question on the screen as well.
Thank you, Alex. Perhaps this ties in quite nicely as well to a finishing note around what is exciting to our panel members about sort of recent trends and innovations, and what they think that is coming on the horizon that may help us to achieve some of our goals that we've discussed today. So I might suggest that we combine those two questions in one. Any panel members who would particularly like to comment in the first instance?
I can jump in and say, yeah, I totally agree with that strengthening doesn't call training. And training is only good up to a point, but what happens once people leave the training? There's also all the know-how, the expertise comes from the years you've worked on in a particular work stream, build your capacity, build your expertise by being confronted to the experience. So how can we put people who have a lot of experience together with people who need accompaniment? And one really strong example is our training on investigations. And I'm going back to training, but of course, it's not because you've gone through a training event that you will be a great investigator. It's a very tricky subject. So we're really investigating and looking at how can we actually create kind of a mentorship scheme that would help relatively new people or people who are new in this field connect to people who have a lot more experience without overloading those that have a lot of experience, but kind of make it a little more worldwide. And there is, of course, the community of practice. It takes time and investment to run really good community of practice, but a really a strong advantage to have that space where people can come, connect, and hear from one another. I also believe in, with all the technology we have today, that we can somehow build a system where we can link up people, looking at the directory would be like maybe a directory of people who have strong expertise in different humanitarian streams and different contexts and from different locations, and you could reach out to them a lot more easily when you need inputs, and often people are happy to share inputs and share their view of their experience with a given situation and challenge.
Thank you, Genevieve. Any of our online panel care to share any examples beyond training or what's exciting for them about capacity development in the future?
Coming here, Sarabjit. Yeah. I think right at the start of the pandemic, I think the way the digital space exploded, and we could overcome the space, time, and cost constraints of capacity development, and could reach out to the remote areas in the local language. I think that was very exciting. It was also exciting from the point of view of that I thought maybe all this old and stale training programs which we were delivering for years would come to an end, and new content and new sort of access to information, knowledge sharing, and capacity sharing happened. And I think it remained so for some time, but now I think we're back to the old ways of working, face-to-face training programs. And I think that's to me it looks like a lost opportunity. We could probably do a little better on that. I'll just end by telling you about a little more exciting thing which is happening in our part of the world, is that strong funding commitment from the government of India for capacity development, about $900 million over a period of 5 years. So that's the kind of commitment that's there for emergency preparedness and response, which is largely for building capacity of the government staff. But it definitely would lead to much larger sort of business share for agencies such as RedR and others, which are in the domain already and are located here in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to invite one more comment from Simeone, which will actually probably be our last comment from the panel members, just to make sure that we do finish on time. Over to you, Simeone.
Thank you. I think it's really a great point in terms of thinking capacity building beyond training. Just to provide an experience with a program that we implement in terms of through CBM Australia, together with the Pacific Disability Forum, a program called the Capacity Building for Organizations of Persons with Disabilities. And then through this program, we went beyond training in terms of one, facilitating and building the platform that enables cross-country learning. One organization of persons with disabilities in one country to be able to learn from another organization of persons with disabilities in a different country, and then through that facilitating discussions around similarities in terms of context, challenges, and also in terms of solutions. Then also looking at the buddy approach in terms of pairing up, as mentioned earlier by one of the panelists, around pairing up a strong organization of persons with disabilities with an organization of persons with disabilities who are still at the infant stage in terms of knowledge and also in terms of operations. And enabling these platforms, facilitating these cross-learnings, you can see that there is a great impact, not just at an organizational level, but also at a personal level between personnel of these organizations while they're sharing knowledge and also they're learning from each other. And also one of the biggest component around capacity building beyond training around coaching and mentoring. This is really important that we build a community of experts to support and also to step in and sustain knowledge and also capacity within the sector and also within the organizations. And one of the things that really strikes me during the whole conversation is around having a capacity building funding facility in which that can support resourcing and sustaining capacity building programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simeone. And thank you to all of our panelists for your time and your input today. It's been fascinating to hear your different viewpoints, your different experiences, and your different ideas as well. I don't think I expected to find resolution today somehow. It seemed fairly unlikely, but that's because there's a really legitimate discourse around the topic of capacity development. It's highly complex, and we all, as we've seen today, have very different experiences, and those experiences impact our current perspectives. So there's been monumental efforts in the past, some successes, some failings. We're still looking for answers. But continuing dialogues like this is where we're going to find those answers, because we know that continuity isn't going to deliver. We need to find, first of all, we need to recognize that no one has the absolute authority or capability to drive the changes that we need. But we've heard today some of the key factors around shifting control, around promoting sustainability, around changing the face of the way that community development, capacity development is funded, turning it on its head, disconnecting it from the project cycle, readdressing who has the power to drive what capacity is built, who builds it and how it's built. Because what we need from today's session is more opportunities to contribute momentum in a continued search for some consensus, a consensus for change in capacity development, and in building the coalition for that change to make sure that we actually succeed in the goals that we've been addressing today: more equitable, more accessible, more effective learning opportunities. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today and wish you all the best. Do take care. Thanks very much.